officials, according to the UN, saying that 20 of their international peacekeepers have been detained by a group of Syrian rebels on the border between Syria and Israel. Earlier, an online video emerged purporting to show an armed group with the captured convoy. Well, joining me live now is our Middle East correspondent, Paula Sleer. Paula, tell us, what do you know? What has happened?
Well, as you say, the United Nations says that around 20 of its peacekeepers have been detained by about 30 armed Syrian fighters. The rebels earlier released a video where they accused the United Nations of assisting the Syrian President Bashar Assad's forces in entering rebel-captured areas. And also in this video, they put forward their demands. Have a listen.
We demand from the US, the UN and the Security Council that the troops of Bashar Assad's regime are withdrawn from the village. Until then, the peacekeepers will remain our hostages. If our demand is not fulfilled, we will treat the hostages as prisoners.
Now, the United Nations has, of course, condemned this incident. The UN is currently negotiating with the rebels. It demands the immediate release of its forces. The United Nations says that its observers were on a regular supply mission earlier on Wednesday when they were stopped by the militants. The UN force was established back in 1974 to monitor the disengagement of Israeli and Syrian forces and maintain the ceasefire between the two countries, who are technically still at war. Israel captured the Golan Heights from Syria back in 1967, and Syrian troops are not allowed in this area. But recently, the area has been the scene of clashes between Syrian rebels and government forces.
But, Paula, the Syrian rebels have just been promised more support from abroad, haven't they?
Yes, they have. Last week, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry announced that the United States will provide food and medical supplies directly to the rebels. Kerry also pledged, in addition, some $60 million in assistance to Syria's political opposition to topple the Syrian President Bashar Assad. Now, this is the first time that the United States has publicly committed itself to sending non-lethal aid to the armed factions that are battling the Syrian president. Britain also hasn't ruled out supplying the rebels with weapons in the future. Also on Wednesday, Arab League ministers said that Arab states are free to offer military support to rebels fighting the forces of Syrian President Bashar Assad, if indeed that is what they wish. The Arab League Secretary General also said that the ministers have invited the opposition Syrian National Coalition, which is the umbrella body for anti-Assad political and rebel groups, to occupy the seat of Syria at the League. Now, what this does mean is more political as well as more diplomatic support for the rebels.
Paula, thanks very much indeed for that live update. That's our correspondent there, Paula Sleer. And Middle East blogger Carl Sharrow, I spoke to him a little earlier here on RT. He has told me that the West is playing with fire, I should say, when it provides weapons to the Syrian rebels.
Can't make sure that the weapons will end up in the intended sides. And again, if you look at the fact that what this incident illustrates with is kind of counterproductive nature, the lack of control that any military authority on the ground for the opposition or outside political authority isn't really doing its job, and it doesn't exercise that control that it claims it does. So the West should really think a lot before doing that and arming the rebels, because they most certainly won't end up with the target groups. It seems that the so-called rebels that are held the UN peacekeepers hostage, they weren't quite sure even what kind of the purpose of the UN group that was there, which is historically has been there to separate Israeli and Syrian troops. So they kind of completely seem to be unfamiliar with what the purpose of those troops are or peacekeepers are, and it kind of they're asking for completely irrational demand. And again, that's another indication of how explosive and irrational the situation has become on the ground.
Venezuela.